This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breege Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally. Gwyn K., Politi, Caitlin N., John H., Tanya T., Veronica S., Gabby, Helen M., Ruth S., Sunny H., Scott K., JRM, C. Roberts, Susie G., Eldritch Priest, and B. Lupita. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and those of you who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there is so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversations on the dark feminine, and extra content, so please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast that deals with the dark feminine. I'm Breege Burke. Now this week we are going to take a turn back into Greek mythology, and we are going to look at a very primordial figure in Greek myth known as Echidna. Now Echidna, the name may or may not be familiar to a lot of people, but she is considered to be the mother of monsters. And Echidna is generally seen as mating with Typhon. Now, anyone familiar with the Hesiod's Theogony, with Hesiod's account of creation, as he tells it, in terms of the overthrowing of Uranus by Kronos. Okay, this is the mythology in which you have the sky god, which is Uranus, and you have Gaia, who is the earth mother. They're in this continual state they're in this merged state. They're in the state of mating. And it's, Uranus comes to her and continually makes love to her, and she continually produces all of these children who are generally monstrous giants. These are some of the earlier titans, and some of the giants, some of the Hecatonkires, which are the 100-handed monsters, all come from this union between Gaia and Uranus, which is quite primal. Gaia herself comes out of chaos, along with Tartarus, Erebus, Nyx, and Eros. When I say Eros, this is primal Eros. I talk about that elsewhere. But if you think about it, Tartarus is the deep abyss, Erebus is the gloom, Nyx, of course, is the night. So you're talking about this idea of chaos and darkness and these initial beings that come out of it. And you sort of see this you initially don't have this separation between sky and earth, essentially. These are the beings that tend to be the progenitors of life, generally speaking, and of course of the gods as well. And in that particular Theogony story, Uranus continually, he's disgusted by the sight of his children, so he continually keeps pushing them back. The way one of my teachers had described it was like if you were trying to give birth and the father was trying to push the baby back into the womb. And Gaia really didn't care much for this mistreatment, so she asks her children to help her, and Kronos, who's equated with Saturn typically in Roman myth, who is also the god associated with time, kind of stands up and says, I'll do it. So she gives him a sickle, and he ends up castrating his father when he comes to his mother, and then that breeds a whole bunch of other monsters, and also the goddess Aphrodite, the goddess of love, interestingly enough. And at this point, Uranus withdraws, and then the sky and the earth are now separate. And of course, as I've often said, who separates them but the god of time? Well, Kronos starts devouring all of his children. He's having children with his sister wife, Rhea, and as he's giving birth to these children, he swallows them until Zeus, Rhea gets tired of this too. She gives him a stone to swallow, and then Zeus is spared, and then we have this sort of heroic battle between the Titans and what later are known as the Olympian gods, for the most part. Not everybody who's on the other side of that battle are Olympians, necessarily. Nonetheless, you have this battle between Kronos and his forces, and his son Zeus, it's a battle for succession, basically. And a battle to bring order into chaos. This is not just about time and death just swallowing things up. This is about creating kind of a structured and ordered universe, the one that we see. However, Gaia is not happy about all the deaths that are occurring of her children. So she's supposedly out of Tartarus. Gaia and Tartarus produce this monster called Typhon. And in other versions of the myth, interestingly, when Zeus gives birth to Athena by himself, because allegedly Athena he comes out of Zeus's forehead, and so she's sort of a child produced just by him. But the Hera gets annoyed by this as his wife, so she produces a child by herself, and supposedly this child is Typhon. Now these are two very, very different stories. But the reason we are talking so much about Typhon here is because he is the partner of Echidna. And supposedly together, they breed a whole brood of monsters, many of which will probably be familiar to you if you are familiar with Greek mythology and the monsters of Greek mythology. Now, there's other sources that say that Echidna is... Well, okay, let me back up for a minute. Echidna is... Again, she's listed as having two different parentages, potentially. And the one is through Phorcys and Cato, who are children connected to Oceanus. Oceanus is the god of the world ocean. I mean, we talked about Pontus, who's the great sea, but then we have Oceanus and Oceanus's wife Tethys, who tends to be associated with fresh water. So these are the Titans, these kind of having to do with these primordial waters. And Phorcys and Cato are two of these sea deities, sea monsters, who actually give birth to, again, another whole host of monstrous beings, Echidna supposedly being one of them, though in another version, Echidna is the child of Chiroe, who is another daughter of Oceanus and Tethys, and Creosaur. And Creosaur is the lesser-known child of Medusa. Most people have heard of Pegasus, the winged horse, who jumps out of Medusa's body after she's beheaded by Perseus. But in addition to Pegasus springing from her body, there's also Creosaur. And Creosaur is said to have been born with a golden sword. Many people seem to think that Creosaur is associated with grain in some way. That golden sword has to do with, has to do something with agriculture or with grain. And we have to remember that Medusa herself, as a Gorgon, is definitely one of these underworld influences. I mean, I have done a podcast on the Gorgons as a whole, and I've also done an individual podcast on Medusa. So I'm not going to get off into their mythologies, but we know Medusa as this primal kind of monstrous force, who again has multiple stories in terms of whether she was born as Medusa among the Gorgons as almost like a Titaness, or whether or not this was a curse placed on her by Athena for sleeping with Poseidon, or for declaring herself more beautiful than Athena, or whatever. There's different variations of that story. But what we have with Echidna, we basically have this woman who is basically half dragon and half woman. I'm going to actually read the entry on Echidna from theoi.com, Theoi, which is a site I always will recommend if you want to get the basics, a free site that gives you all the basics on Greek myth, on only Greek deities, but Greek monsters, daemons, all the different things. It's really good, because it'll give you a basic definition or a basic description of that particular deity, and then it actually gives you all of the primary source material translated as well. So I will read this here. Echidna was a monstrous she-dragon, Dracana, with the head and breast of a woman and the tail of a coiling serpent. She probably represented the corruptions of the earth, rot, slime, fetid waters, illness, and disease. Okay. Now, keep in mind that what we tend to think of as or what the ancients might have perceived as what we now call demonic. And I don't mean daemonic, I mean demonic in a negative, more evil sense, were probably beings associated with disease, because disease represented kinds of evil spirits that you wanted to get rid of. And we're going to talk a little bit about the rot factor in a little bit. Now, Echidna was sometimes equated with Python. Yeah, Python is it's more than a programming language. Python, and we tend to equate the types of snakes that we call pythons. But Python is, in fact, a dragon, and the name actually means the rotting one. It's born of the fetid slime left behind by the Great Deluge. Okay, so there is a Greek version of the flood story that features Deucalion and Pyrrha, who are children of Prometheus and Epimetheus, respectively. And Deucalion is warned by Prometheus that Zeus is going to send this great flood to wipe humanity out. and the two of them get inside a little chest. This is very, this sounds a lot like the Noah's Ark story, which is actually probably the latest of all of them, because there's also a Babylonian story and a Sumerian story, which are far, far older. All of these flood stories about floating around in a chest or an ark or a boat or something for some specified period of time, and then having a bird come and bring some kind of sign of life. Again, it varies by story. But Deucalion and Pyrrha is another one of these, and they actually repopulate the earth they go to the temple of Themis, goddess of order, because there's nobody left but them. I mean, they're the only two people left alive. So she tells them, throw the bones of your mother behind you, and they pick up rocks and they throw the rocks behind them, and as they do, people start springing out of the ground. So this is the deluge that we're talking about. But as, of course, the waters recede, as we know from any kind of flood that we see, if you've experienced mass flooding in a place, there is this kind of slimy, dirty water residue that's left behind in places, or kind of that kind of sliminess of, depending on what kind of a flood it is. If you're talking about a flood of seawater, you could actually have seaweed and other things just kind of rotting around in different places after the waters recede. And this creates a very regressive effect. Water tends to wipe something clean. It tends to regress something back to an earlier state. So that's something to think about when we think about this. This idea of Echidna as this python, as this rotting one that represents this sort of primordial state, or getting back to an earlier state. To continue with this, others name her the Tartarian lamprey being a kind of a fish, and Tartarian being, of course, one of the abyss, and place her in the dark, swampy pit of Tartarus beneath the earth. Hesiod makes her a daughter of monstrous sea gods, and presumably associates her with rotting sea scum and fetid salt marshes. Yeah, because salt marshes are another place where you will have that kind of rot, or that lovely aroma of rot. Okay, Echidna was the consort of Typhus, or Typhon, a monstrous multi-headed storm giant who challenged Zeus to the throne of heaven. Yes, the one who was sent up by Gaia. Together they spawned a host of terrible monsters to plague the earth, including the Chimera, or the Chimera, as it properly said in Greek, or the Chimera, Cerberus, or sometimes people say Cerberus, who is the three-headed dog that guards the underworld. The Chimera being a being that's got a body of parts of multiple animals. Okay, when we talk about something as being, actually we use the term chimeric when something has the DNA of more than one species or more than one type. We call it chimeric. Okay, so the Chimera is like that. The Hydra, we've heard of, the Sphinx, and the Drakon Hesperios, or the dragon of the Hesperides. And this is a dragon that guards a tree of golden apples that are in the Hesperides, these gardens of the Western lands. And again, it's worth remembering that the Western lands in probably a lot of Near Eastern myth have to do with the underworld, with the place of death. 4 other closely related she-dragons, with the Argive Echidna and Poina, and the Tartarian Campe, with the Phocian Cerberus. Okay, we're probably not going to... We have enough to talk about without going off into those alleyways, but those are other sea monsters of very, very similar type to Echidna. Now, there's a number of stories associated with her. As I said, yes, she's either the child of Phorcys and Keto, which is what Hesiod claims, and then she is the child of Tartarus and Gaia, as according to Apollodorus. So that's certainly a later Roman source. And her offspring vary. Some people say that her children by Typhus were Orthos, who's a 2-headed dog, Cerberus, the 3-headed dog, the Hydra, and the Chimera. And another that is from Hesiod. And then there's another list from Apollodorus that adds the Caucasian eagle, the Hesperidian dragon, and the Cromman sow. And then Gorgo, who is another female underworld monster figure, sometimes is considered to be one of her offspring, at least according to Hyginus. And just looking down the list here, supposedly there's also a group called the Echnidnas, which are, according to Nonnus Dionysiaca. So we've got all these different ideas. Nonetheless, these are all of these monstrous beings. And what these monstrous beings tend to have in common, they're either like dragon-type or serpent-type figures, or they are some kind of a mutation or of other multiple species, or of some other kind of thing, like I said, like animals with two heads, 2 or 3 heads. So let's see, what do we have here about her? What I want to get into is what the classical literature actually says about her. So according to Hesiod in the Theogony, he says, but she, Cato, bore to Phorcus another unmanageable monster, nothing like human nor like the immortal gods either, in a hollow cave. That's the other thing that's important about Echidna too, is that she is associated with this cave that she lives in. And caves frequently have strong womb imagery, and they also are often connected as entryways to the underworld. They're very, very, very strong Earth Mother association there. This was the divine and haughty Echidna, and half of her is a nymph with a fair face and eyes glancing, but the other half is a monstrous serpent, a terrible, enormous, squirming, and voracious, there in the earth's secret places. For there she has her cave on the underside of a hollow rock, far from the immortal gods and far from all mortals. There the gods ordained her a fabulous home to live in, which she keeps underground among the Armoi. Grisly Echidna, a nymph who never dies, and all her days she is ageless. Yeah, Aramoi, I think it's how you say Arama or Aramoi. This tends to be the place. And there's a whole big discussion of geographically where that might be, which I'm not going to get into. But nonetheless, this is also considered to be the dwelling place of Typhon. Now, Homer's Iliad, it says, Zeus who delights in thunder were angry. That seems wrong. This is Richmond Lattimore's translation. Probably means was. Zeus who delights in thunder was angry, as when he batters the earth about Typhus in the land of the Armoi, where they say that Typhus lies prostrate. This is the same underground home given to Echidna. Okay, so it's not that Echidna is directly mentioned by Homer in the Iliad. That is the idea that is mentioned there. It says, they said, note, both Homer and Hesiod mention that Typhus and Echidna were imprisoned beneath the stormy land of the Armoi, a semi-mythical Scythian tribe also called, or Aramaspoi, okay, I'm trying to read this, or the Chimerians, who dwell at the ends of the earth in eternal gloom. And so they're saying, in other words, that they resided in Tartarus. But yeah, there's a whole lot of mythology surrounding both the Scythians and the Chimerians that are probably not going to be part of this, but that is another potential rabbit hole to go down with this. So we have, so men say that Typhus, the terrible, outrageous, and lawless, was joined in love to her, meaning Echidna, the maid with glancing eyes. So she conceived and brought forth fierce offspring. First she bare Orthus, the hound of Geryon. And, some of these names, I'm going to go back over some of these names. And then again she bare a second, a monster not to be overcome, that may not be described, Cerberus, who eats raw flesh, the brazen-voiced hound of Hades. 50-headed, relentless, and strong. Okay, well, we usually think of Cerberus as having 3 heads. Hesiod's claiming that Cerberus has 50 heads. And again she bore a third, the evil-minded Hydra of Lerna, whom the goddess white-armed Hera nourished, being angry beyond measure with the mighty Heracles. Okay, yeah, Heracles is who we want to think about here. She was the mother of Chimera, or the Chimera, who breathed raging fire, a creature fearful, great, swift-footed, and strong, who had 3 heads, one of a grim-eyed lion, in her hinder part a dragon, and in her middle a goat, breathing forth a fearful blast of blazing fire. Her Pegasus and noble Bellerophontes slay. So Bellerophon, actually riding on Pegasus, slays the Chimera. Okay, so Homeric hymn to Apollo, the third one. Straightway large-eyed queenly Hera took him, her child, the monster Typhon. See, here is where Typhon is the child of Hera. And bringing one evil thing to another such, gave him to the Dracana, meaning Echidna or the Python, and she received him. And this Typhon used to work great mischief among the famous tribes of men. Phoebus Apollon, this is Homeric hymn to Apollo also, boasted over her, meaning Python. Against cruel death neither Typhus, her consort, shall avail you, nor ill-fated Chimera, but here shall the earth and shining Hyperion, Helios the sun, make you rot. Pytho. Okay. So this gets us down to the two main stories that we have about Echidna. And one has to do with Python, and one has to do with Heracles. So the Python story has to do with Apollo. When he comes to Delphi at a place that he wishes to establish his oracle, this is also the place where Python is. And Python is associated with Echidna. Now, there's different versions of this. When I read the Dictionary of Classical Myth, it suggests that Apollo decides to kill Python because Python also gives oracles, and therefore Python is a rival to Apollo in terms of being able to give predictions or to give oracles, which is a gift that Apollo has. And when we know anything about the god Apollo is not going to be, he's going to treat very poorly anybody who might best him in any way. And so he actually slays Python in that place. And then, of course, as we know, when he builds the oracle, it's over this pit that is known as the Pythia, because he's also known as Pythian Apollo because of this. But what he does after he slays her is this is what he says. He says, "Against cruel death neither shall avail you nor ill-famed Chimera." So, in other words, regardless, they're not going to be able to, the Typhon, the Chimera, Echidna, they're not going to be able to kill some people to overcome anybody. And it says, "But here the earth and shining Hyperion," in this case, this is the Titan name for the sun god, also known as Helios, "will make you rot." Okay, so there's this idea that you have this large dragon that's laying there that no longer has the power to harm or to do anything, but will lay there and will rot. Okay, which is why they have the name Pytho or Python. So this is the sun rotting the corpse of this great serpent. And if you think about, even if you just think about fish rotting, like on a shore, pretty disgusting. I mean, it's just this idea of this decomposition of this kind of reptilian or this ichthyan kind of flesh that is there. Okay, so that is one particular story, is this story of Python and connected to Echidna, and thus this is why we see her associated with things that rot. Now, there's another story, and I'm looking at the Dictionary of Classical Myth, the one that my trusty one that I've had since grad school. So we have, they mention all of her monstrous offspring and all the things we've just talked about. But here in the second paragraph, in quite a different tradition related by Herodotus, when Heracles visited Scythia, he left his horses to graze while he slept, and when he awoke, he found they had disappeared. As he searched, he came across Echidna in a cave. She promised to return his horses if he agreed to couple with her. He consented, and as a result, Echidna gave birth to Agathyrsus, Gelonus, and Scythes. Yeah, I'm trying to think how that would be said in Greek. Scythes. Okay, these are three. And now, further, which they don't mention here with that story, is that Echidna asks him, "Well, what should I do with your three sons? Should I keep them here where I am queen," as she says, "or should I return them to you? Do you want them to come live with you?" So he gives her a bow and a belt, and says, "Whichever of my sons picks up the bow and puts on the belt can be sent back to him. The others," he says, "just send away." Okay. So there's one of, I can't remember which one of the three sons actually is the one who ends up picking it up. I want to say it's Scythes, I think, is the one that actually picks up the belt and the bow and becomes the kind of progenitor of the Scythians. I think that's right. But in any case, so there's this connection to Heracles. Now, there's anybody who's been kind of paying attention who knows about the 12 labors of Heracles would also notice that at this point that a lot of these children that Echidna has, okay, so the Lernean Hydra, for example, and the dragon of the Hesperides. There's a couple of other ones there. Well, not the Sphinx so much in this particular case. The Sphinx ends up being overcome by Oedipus, okay, when he comes to the gate of Thebes. But many of these others end up, actually Cerberus, that's the other one that I'm thinking of. All of them are involved in the labors of Heracles, and where Heracles either kills them or he has to subdue them in some fashion. Like Cerberus, he actually takes from Hades, brings back to the king, and then he has to, once it's acknowledged that he completed that labor, he brings Cerberus back to the underworld. So he doesn't actually kill Cerberus. But there's definitely, he does at least kill at least two of these particular children of Echidna. So it's very interesting that he ends up mating with Echidna and producing three other children. Heracles tends to be a representation of strength or force, actually. he's sort of this ideal of this kind of brute force overcoming these certain chthonic types of beings. Whether they're connected to the underworld itself, whether they are monstrous, whether they are connected to the forests. In the case of the hind that is sacred to Artemis, that he ends up capturing, and that she takes a bit of issue with. But then when she finds out why he's doing it, then she's kind of like, okay, well, basically as long as he brings it back, it was fine. And even with the idea of Geryon, the cattle of Geryon, we have another child of hers, the Orthos, who is connected with Geryon, who is also considered to be, who is a fire type deity or fire type being that is also considered to be cannibalistic, who was killed, smoked out of his cave, I think, and killed by Heracles. So you've got this strong connection between Heracles in his labors and Echidna. And so that whole idea leads me to the next thing that I had wanted to mention about this. This has to do with what we can see represented. Like when we get down to Echidna, what exactly does she represent? Exactly what is she? And there's three or four basic things that I would like to kind of mention in connection with that. Okay, first has to do with the idea of something that rots. Now, when we think of something that rots, again, it's something that it's putrid, it's disgusting, and it usually has a foul odor. And it's something that we consider when we think about something as just being dirty or potentially infectious or filled with kind of living creatures that might be toxic to us. And it's the kind of thing we associate with stagnant water. Those kind of pools of water there's no fresh water running through them. It's when something is stagnated. So in the one sense, when we think about that stagnant water and the kinds of things that grow out of it, it's really a good, I'll say metaphor or allegory, or probably more of a metaphor for what goes on in the mind when the mind becomes stuck. There is a stuckness that breeds these kinds of disease. It has this fetid effect in which it can breed all kinds of toxic things. And these are the ways in which we become stuck. And that stuckness can be everything from overanalysis to actual depression. Okay, so there's this idea of this being stuck or being slowed down in this way, or being trapped in this fashion, because there's no movement. The flow of water tends to represent emotional movement of some type. And so when we're looking at something that's stagnant, it's not moving, it's not dynamic, okay? It's something that has become stuck or static. However, on the other hand, when it comes to something like that, yeah, on the one hand, we say, well, this is the idea of life not moving. However, one thing that you can talk about when it comes to decayed matter and decayed plant life, that kind of foul water that we think of as polluted, that polluted stuff is actually teeming with life. There's microbial life in that kind of water. And it's almost a little ecosystem of its own. Now, that ecosystem might be toxic to us as humans. So it is something that it's kind of a life. It's kind of a life that is associated with death in that sense. It's the kind of thing that we want to use the flowing water to clean or to purify, or sometimes in the way that people might use heat as well or fire to dry up such a thing. And in fact, that's what we see in the Python story. We see Hyperion, which is the sun, drying up this rotting corpse of Python. And in that way, this idea of this kind of combination of fire and this water, this putrid water, you actually have the fertile ground for something new to come out of it. When we think about alchemy is about creating gold out of basically crap. I mean, out of the fetid, disgusting stuff of the earth. So this is like the alchemical raw material that we see in Echidna, mother of monsters. And there's something to be thought about there, because when we think about monsters, what do they end up representing for us? Well, monsters have a lot to do with the terrors that we have that can be external or that they can be internal. For example, when we talked about Scylla and Charybdis tend to represent the terrors of the sea, as do the Gorgons to a certain degree are connected to that as well. And also we have other figures like that, like the Gray Eye, who are connected with old age, but all of them seem to have this terrifying connection that's connected to the sea. And we see Echidna in particular connected to a cave. Okay, so this is the idea of these cave dwelling kinds of monstrous creatures. If you think about the idea of going into a cave, people who go in and they suddenly encounter some horrible thing at the other end of the cave. I mean, it's this terror of going into these subterranean spaces, into these unknown spaces, which may also be associated with the sea as well. I remember being down in Cornwall last year, and it was going to this one place where there's this massive cave. It was supposed to be a cave where pirates went and hid, or there was supposed to be some kind of a passageway from there to somewhere on the mainland. But this cave, when the tide came in, was completely filled with water. So I don't know. You have this strong connection between caves and water, and so you have this very watery aspect to a monster like Echidna, as well as this very highly chthonic, literally very chthonic aspect, chthonic having to do with the actual earth itself. And that element of decay and decomposition is what allows for transformation. Okay, so Echidna is really the raw material out of which things can come, but it can breed monsters, and those monsters represent those underworld forces that we have to come to terms with in some fashion. Now, that brings us to the aspect of her offspring, and of her, actually, because she looks like she's half nymph, okay, so half beautiful nymph and half reptile. And similarly, all of her children, they either have multiple heads, or there's some kind of mutation of what we would think of as an animal that we're used to seeing, like a dog. But something like the Chimera in particular has all of these different things, part lion, part goat, part the tail of some kind of reptilian kind of hindquarters. And this idea of this being that is kind of a mishmash of all of these different kinds of animals, what it might remind some people of is I think of the avatars of Vishnu, certainly. In particular, there's ones like Varaha and Narasimha in particular. I just want to remind you of the story a little bit of Narasimha as a slight diversion here. Now, Narasimha is an avatar of Vishnu that is there to kill the Ashura Hiranyakashipu. And Hiranyakashipu is also, one of his incarnations is also killed by Vishnu as Varaha, which is more of a boar-like avatar. But Narasimha is interesting. This is a lion avatar. And so I'm going to read the story here. This is just from Wikipedia. It says, Hiranyakashipu gained a boon from Brahma, due to which he could not be killed by day or night, inside or outside the house, neither in the sky, nor on land, nor in Svarga, nor in Patala, which are these realms. These are other worlds. So in other words, not in this world, or in the underworld, or in this other in the heavens, by any weapon, nor by humans, deities, demons, or animals. Now, that sounds like that covers a lot of territory, doesn't it? Okay. Endowed with this boon, he began to wreak chaos and havoc, persecuting all the devotees of Vishnu, including his own son, Prahalada. Vishnu, cognizant of the Ashura's boon, creatively assumed a hybrid form that was neither human nor animal as a lion in the name of Narasimha, and Narasimha disemboweled and killed Hiranyakashipu, and at the junction of day and night, the threshold of his palace, which was neither inside nor outside, upon his lap and with his claws. Narasimha is primarily known as the Great Protector, who defends and protects devotees from evil. Similarly, the Shakti of Narasimha, known as Narasimhi, is also very similarly invoked in such a manner. And they're very much connected with the idea of Dharma, which makes sense because Vishnu is the preserver. He's about the preserver of Dharma, preserver of order. So, but this story is interesting, and I feel like it relates back to this chimeric aspect of Echidna's children, in the idea that they somehow manage to defy what we think of as our ordinary categories. They manage to be many things at one time. And for this reason, we tend to think of them as having a kind of liminality. So she herself represents two things at once, something mammalian and reptilian, while she's also neither. These beings tend to devour humans, as you might expect monsters, but when you see a monster that is part dragon and appears to have at least a partly human-looking face, devouring humans, sometimes they're referred to as being cannibalistic, which cannibalistic is just kind of tends to be a catch-all for eating human flesh. I feel like cannibalism has to do with eating your own species, really. But again, there's definitely this devouring element too, and this devouring along with rot. So we definitely have some very strong Chthonic death imagery here. This idea of rot, but also of this alchemical transformation that goes on. And the liminal nature of her children, the fact that they are neither this nor that. They're all of these creatures at the same time, and they're none of them, which is definitely the characteristic of something that is liminal. When we talk about liminality, we are talking about something that it's neither nor, it's both and neither nor at the same time. So in this case, Echidna becomes a kind of initiatory, transformative force. She becomes a force for change in the most basic sense, because she represents those things that come out of liminal space, and represents that something that defies all categories. And in a world where order seems to rely on our dualistic way of looking at things, or at least the idea of separateness, this has to be this, meaning it can't be that. If it's male, it can't be female. If it's day, it can't be the characteristics of night. If it's a plant, it's not an animal. You know what I mean? We look at everything in terms of, if it's one thing, it therefore cannot be the other. I'm recording this on October 13th, actually, so we're right around just before the lunar eclipse on lucky Friday the 13th. But it's only going to be about 18 more days till Samhain, or Halloween, as people like to call it. And one of the things about Samhain is it's a gateway place between this world and the other world. And as that is often celebrated, the whole idea of people dressing up and so forth, oftentimes this would include switching roles. You would see this in Bacchic rituals too, where the people who were high status became low status. The people who are low status are the ones in charge. Men dressed as women, women dressed as men. I mean, there's this whole reversal that goes on that is also part of the liminality of an initiatory ritual as well. But particularly when we're talking of, there's certain Native American rituals where that kind of thing is part of the transformation process, because you're in a state where you're both things and you're also neither one. So to me, Echidna, her monstrous offspring, are these other possibilities that we see. This is also, for those of you who are occultists out there, this is also Baphomet. I mean, Baphomet sits at the middle of the tree of life, right? And Baphomet is both male and female. Baphomet is both human and animal. Baphomet salve coagula, dissolution and reunion or recoagulation, coming back together again. It's the mudras for dark and for light, has both the moon and the sun. You have all of these elements in one, because this is a creature that is both and is neither. It's a liminal type of creature, and often represented among initiates is this idea of all the possibilities for incarnation. So a mother like Echidna and her offspring represent all of these possibilities for existence. So within this, there's a lot of possibility. However, we also have this element of stuckness. There's this danger, certainly, of being stuck in this particular space. And one of the things we certainly fear about liminal space is that we are going to be stuck in one of those places. So it's like the rot and decay has to happen in order to transform into the next thing. There's this almost symbolic kind of process that goes on psychologically that represents the way in which something has to be allowed to rot and to die, so that it creates the fertile material to create the new thing that's coming. But you don't, a lot of times you have these myths of of slaying these particular monsters. And this would, again, this feels to me, especially with a force like Heracles, with this very, very strongly masculine force who represents this kind of brute force, although he is also very mentally very quick, Heracles. Although the reason he's condemned to his labors is because Hera has inflicted madness on him. And it's really interesting how she gets involved in all of this, the queen, the civilized queen of the gods. But I have a whole separate podcast on Hera, so that would probably be worth listening to in terms of her as this kind of dark. Actually, I've seen scholars refer to her as almost a Satan-like figure in the way that she acts, which is fascinating if you consider her role. But Heracles mating with Echidna. I mean, this is the idea of this kind of a very kind of brute masculine force mating with this very chthonic feminine force, and the idea that the one that chooses to pick up the mantle of the father is the one to be sent to him. The other two are to be rejected. It's interesting how that comes about, and how Heracles ends up killing a lot of the children of Echidna, and so. I don't know, if we consider the fact that this has all happened because Heracles descends into madness, and by the way, murders his own children and Megara, whom he has the children with. This is almost like that atonement process that goes on for slaying of the mother and slaying of the children. And interestingly, he bears new children with the mother of monsters. So there's a very strong metaphorical thing about the kind of journey into that space, that unconscious space, that collective space that we don't really know what's there. We never can know what's there. The ego and its rationality and its tools can never really know what's there. We can only get inflections of what's there through what we see in other people, what we might express through art, in language, potentially through poetry, and also perhaps through music. You have that. These are the expressions of this space. These are not expressions of the rational and the orderly. These are the expressions of the disorderly. So it's very interesting when we talk about the monstrous, and you think about the hero myth where the hero either goes into the underworld or is swallowed by the beast, right? And as we see frequently, a lot of these beasts are feminine in nature because they represent that kind of threatening, devouring force, not only of the collective unconscious, but of the earth itself, of the underworld. And this seems like an evil or terrifying thing in a culture that says that the underworld is something that has been conquered. In the Christian view of, say, salvation, Christ conquers death. And again, James Hillman has a tremendous amount to say about that in his book, The Dream in the Underworld. Hillman's one of those who thinks that our external identity, we tend to think of one as real and we tend to think of the other as irrational or unreal. He says, no, actually, they're both unreal in some sense, but that one must encounter the underworld if you want to encounter your actual humanity, if you want to encounter your actual life. You have to go in and face those monsters. But the question is, are you vanquishing those monsters, or through the process of perhaps being devoured in some sense by those monsters, do you end up kind of moving through this liminal space to become something else? Or are these monsters just as representations of all these possibilities through which they mutate in that very fetid and disgusting, but also very fertile ground that can create disease and death, but is the place for which this alchemical change can take place, and where we can change. So there's a lot of mystery to that, and I feel like it is the mystery that surrounds initiation, whether you're talking a formal initiation or a natural one. We all go through these passages in our lives. I mean, we don't really live in a culture now where we have formal rites of passage because we don't have a formal mythical system that we all subscribe to. We kind of have a leftover of the monotheistic biblical one combined with our mechanistic ideas about science, and nothing that really comes together. I mean, individuals may cling to certain aspects of these other traditions, but really we don't live in a space where we have any kind of unified collective vision. Everybody has to kind of find their own way. And so the encountering of these monsters, as it were, these are the possibilities This is the idea of this dark feminine as something that is both and neither nor, represents a lot of these possibilities. But also in that, I mean, yes, it can be absolutely terrifying and something that we feel that we have to work to overcome, to not let it overcome us. But at the same time, we also have to recognize that is they represent those forces that allow us to transform ourselves as well. I mean, that there's the relevance of death and decay. This is why you don't want to get rid of that, because in doing that, living in this space that's purified of that all the time, then you are nothing more than a machine in some ways. You don't have that human element. You don't have that fertile ground for creativity of any type, whether it be mental creativity or whether it has to do with physically creating something, like whether you make something with your hands, when a woman gives birth to a child, whatever it is. It has to do with that creative element and the way in which death and decay are a part of that. And we had talked a bit about that last week last podcast when we talked about Anat and about her role in bringing Baal back by fighting and killing and absolutely grinding to nothing the king of the underworld, so that he becomes the seed for the new thing to sprout. Similarly here, we have this idea of like a mother of rot, as it were, of rot and decay, that is actually that fertile ground for transformation. And what she gives birth to are all of these different possibilities that are really outside of our rational mind, or that kind of put us in this in-between space. But then the challenge is, how do we move through that liminal space? How do we allow ourselves to be transformed in that process? I want to thank you very much for listening. As always, I want to thank my patrons, as I did at the very beginning of this podcast. You can join my subscribers at patreon.com/Chthonia. If you're interested, I do extra podcasts. I do a Fiction Friday on Instagram where I read from my fiction, but the Patreon subscribers get my unpublished work read there as well. And there's also there's other benefits that come with different levels, including other lectures, courses, and things that I offer that are free depending on your level on Patreon. My website is Chthonia.net, and all of my stuff is there: podcast stuff, my publications, and some of the basic information about my work, plus the school that I run, Scholars of the Borderland, all are hosted at that place. You can find me on social media, Chthonia Podcast, one word on Twitter or whatever it is now, Instagram, and apparently YouTube also is now showing me as Chthonia Podcast, where it was just Chthonia before, and of course Chthonia Podcast is 2 words on Facebook. Thanks so much for listening, and until the next episode.